For many years, Russia supplied the United States with RD-180 rocket engines. However, after the well-known geopolitical events, Washington stopped this cooperation and refused further purchases of these engines, which had been used to launch American rockets for decades. Now ambitious China, a recognized leader in high technology, has expressed its desire to become a new buyer of the legendary RD-181. This move could have a tremendous impact on the development of the celestial space industry. Advanced Russian developments in rocket engineering combined with China's powerful manufacturing capabilities can bring their joint space programs to a fundamentally new level. I wonder how the US will react to this. The fact is that China, like Russia, is forced to look for alternative ways of development under the pressure of Western sanctions. It is actively establishing ties with other powers in such critical high-tech industries that were out of the question before. A recent example is Russia's possible sale of its most advanced rocket engine, RD-181, to China. Of course, this is only a commercial deal for the purchase of the engines. No transfer of production technology has been reported yet. Russia is extremely jealous of its know-how in this area. For example, it recently refused even to sell China Mk-32 engines for the Tu-160 strategic bomber. For understanding, RD-180, on the basis of which the 181st was created, has long been no longer produced in Russia. It has been significantly modernized. Previously, Russia supplied RD-180 engines to the United States for many years, and the Americans successfully used them to launch their missiles. As is well known, they never managed to steal this technology from them. There are things in the rocket business that cannot be revealed even with a finished product. Special algorithms for metal processing, alloy formulations, heat treatment, and hardening methods. The rest of the world is still lagging behind Russia in materials science. The superiority of the Russian rocket industry is due to the fact that back in the Soviet era, a bet was made on the development of liquid propellant rocket engines, while the US emphasized solid propellant engines. As a result, the Americans miscalculated and were forced to buy Russian engines for decades. Previously, only Russian and American rockets used these engines. Even Europeans were not allowed to touch such advanced technology. And now there is news that China's space ambitions can be seriously supported by the best Russian developments in this field. So how has the US reacted to this? In Washington, they seem to have dropped their jaws at such a course of events. They simply did not expect such a thing. It was a blow below the belt, so to speak. After all, as you know, the hegemon usually does not share advanced technologies and is perplexed when someone does something that he does not do himself. For decades, the United States has been buying rocket engines from Russia, including the advanced RD-181, for its space programs. Washington was so thoroughly hooked on these engines that it did not want to get them up until the very last moment. Recently, however, they were forced to stop cooperating with Russian suppliers due to well-known events, which caused serious changes in the US space technology industry. Now already Russia and China are discussing a possible sale of RD-181 rocket engines, which would be a major development in the two countries' space cooperation. After the loss of the US market for Roscosmos, this will be an important source of financial support, so Russia clearly stands to gain from this deal. Covering the production of Russian rocket engines, Xinhua, one of China's largest media companies, noted that in the Soviet legacy, the Russian Federation has managed not only to preserve but also to multiply its achievements in this industry. The move, according to Chinese experts, will lead to a new era of cooperation between Russia and China, with joint projects that will have a lasting impact on the global space industry. US analysts warn that a possible close partnership between Russia and China in space portends extremely unpleasant consequences for the West. The merging of Russian advanced technologies with China's powerful industrial capabilities could lead to serious geopolitical shifts that would affect the vital interests of the United States. In sum, Washington has dealt a strategic blow to itself in its confrontation with Russia. For decades, the United States has freely purchased rocket engines from Russia, and now it is left without these engines and with the sword of Damocles in the form of their possible sale to its main opponent, China. Some researchers believe that the country that is cooler economically is the one that has a lower crime rate. And since the US is many times worse than Russia on this parameter, it is time to recalculate the real GDP of both countries. And it may turn out that the Russian economy is not so weak compared to the American one, as it is commonly believed. I've always been surprised by the assertion that since California's GDP is higher than Russia's, the people of California are automatically richer than the Russians. But the UK, France, and Italy have a lower combined GDP than the state of California alone. It turns out that in these countries everyone lives poorer. But in countries like India, where GDP is comparable to California's, almost 1 billion people live below the poverty line or even in poverty. That's about 70% of the population. You see the distortions that arise when comparing by GDP alone. A high GDP does not guarantee prosperity for the majority of a country's citizens, just as a low GDP does not mean that everyone lives poorly. One day it may turn out that in the USA, with its astronomical GDP of $21 trillion, people live worse than, for example, in Brazil with its GDP of $2 trillion. I am not talking about Russia, because there, despite the smaller GDP compared to Brazil, there are not tens of millions of beggars living in slums around big cities, as in Brazil. By the way, Brazil's GDP is more than $1.5 trillion higher than Canada's. But would anyone doubt that life in Canada is incomparably better and more prosperous than in Brazil? Which of these countries would you prefer to move to for permanent residence? In general, all these measures of GDP are worthless if the goal is to find out which country is really better to live in. It is much more important what exactly the size of GDP of a country depends on. To begin with, it is worth recalling that GDP is the gross domestic product, which is expressed in the sum of prices for all goods and services produced in the country. At first glance, everything is simple and clear. There is no room for manipulation. However, in practice there are possibilities for different interpretations when calculating GDP in different countries. The fact is that at the legislative level, the methods of GDP calculation may differ. These calculations are made by various financial organizations on the basis of data received from the official structures of the respective states. In other words, whatever figures they receive, such GDP will be calculated. I do not want to say that the US intentionally falsifies its data. It is just that the Americans calculate according to their own methods that take into account their own realities. But different countries may have different realities, which may cause their real GDP to be significantly underestimated compared to the US, although in reality the standard of living may be no worse, if not better. Take Switzerland or Luxembourg, for example. No one doubts that the quality of life there is one of the highest in the world. But if you count by the methodology adopted in the United States, their GDP will be much lower than in the States because of the peculiarities of the national economy. So GDP figures by themselves say little about the real state of affairs in a country. Now let's see how exactly GDP is calculated in the USA, and why in Russia it turns out to be orders of magnitude lower, although in fact Russia is no less powerful than the USA, and the standard of living of the majority of citizens is not worse, and sometimes even higher than in America. Yes, official average salaries in Russia are significantly lower than in the US if recalculated in dollars. But this does not mean that the average Russian cannot afford the same things as the average American. The fact is that Russia has much lower prices for goods and services compared to the US, and turnover adjusted for the difference in population is virtually the same. In other words, both Americans and Russians buy the same goods. Only Russians spend a smaller amount in currency equivalent. Moreover, the quality of consumer goods in Russia is often higher, especially when it comes to food. The key difference is that, unlike Americans, Russians save much more on various household services. And this markedly reduces the size of Russian GDP compared to American GDP. Here is an illustrative example. In the United States, even a simple outlet a person is not allowed to repair on his own. It is mandatory to call a certified master electrician, and the cost of paying for his services is included in the US GDP. In Russia, the same call is just a neighbor Uncle Vasya, whose income will never be included in the official GDP of Russia. It seems like a small thing, but after all, with problems in the outlets faced by residents throughout the territory of a huge 145 million people in the country. Now, do you understand where such a high GDP in the USA comes from and why it is fundamentally lower in Russia? In Russia, a lot of work is done without any certification and is paid in envelopes. For example, the construction of country houses by the hands of gastarbeiters from Central Asia. whose incomes are also often not included in Russian GDP. According to the most conservative estimates, the share of the gray economy in Russia reaches 40%, while in the United States, with its millions of illegal Mexican guest workers, it is at most 10%. If it is fully taken into account in the calculations, the real GDP of Russia will grow not by 40%, but by 70 to 80% just due to unrecorded repairs of sockets, construction work, etc. But this is not all the reasons for the underestimation of Russian GDP compared to the American indicator. In the US, the main share of GDP is formed by the service sector, and it's not only socket repair services. In America, the sphere of legal services is overdeveloped. When in Russia, people prefer to solve problems by human agreement when disputes arise. In the USA, any trifle immediately becomes a reason for court proceedings involving expensive lawyers. Another example is the construction and repair of housing. In Russia, private houses are often built by teams of illegal guest workers, whose labor is not taxed. In the United States, the slightest remodeling requires a lot of permits, hire licensed professionals, and all this paperwork. Payment for expertise and high salaries of craftsmen increases the country's GDP. We can say that in Russia, many works are performed neighborly or just humanely, without official registration and accounting. But in the USA, virtually any service, any repair becomes a reason for hiring certified specialists, paying for licenses, permits, and taxes. And all these considerable costs are automatically included in the GDP, creating the illusion of prosperity of the American economy. In reality, there is no prosperity for the majority of ordinary Americans. The real income of the middle class in the US has not grown for many years, but property inequality is growing. There is only a semblance of GDP growth due to a bloated service sector and a squeezed system of licensing and regulation. In Russia, however, the real well-being of the middle class has been growing quite noticeably in recent years. Now, according to sociologists' calculations, about 70% of Russians consider themselves to be middle class. At the same time, the quality of mass-demand goods, food, household appliances, cars has increased many times over, while prices remain much cheaper than in the West. Russians are eating better, traveling, and buying quality imported goods that they could not afford before. Therefore, one should not blindly believe the figures of GDP per capita. The real welfare in the country can be very different from this. Not to mention the fact that Russia is often the source of the most advanced innovations in science and high technology, which determine the face of the 21st century. In this matter, Americans recognize our leadership. In conclusion, I would like to thank you for your attention and interest in my interpretation of this difficult but very important topic. Leave likes and subscribe to the channel to not miss new interesting videos. I wish you all happiness, health, and prosperity.